Listen, I'm hoping today's episode will inform you, challenge you, and cause you to follow Jesus Christ. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get to it. Hey folks, it is great to be back at Proving God's Will. It's been a couple of minutes since I have made my last podcast, so good to have you here on the audio version, also on the video version on YouTube. So some of you may be watching this, some of you may be just hearing this as you drive down the road. But today on Proving God's Will, we're going to talk about a topic that I think is crucially important. It's absolutely imperative that we understand this, and that is God's leadership in the church, but then also just God's leadership and how He chooses to get things done. Today, we're kind of in a mode here in our country where we don't really want anyone to be in charge. There's this sort of rejecting authority, if you will. Even in some of the churches, you find that the pastor is supposed to be this overseer, spiritual overseer of the church. And even today, sometimes in some churches, the pastor is just viewed as like anybody else. And I get that to a certain degree, but the truth is, at the judgment seat of Christ, the pastor is going to be held to a different measure than everyone else in terms of how he led and how he listened to the Lord, but then also followed the Lord's leadership and led the local church. Now, there's times where we don't want anyone to make a decision, or we want to vote on everything. So as I'm recording this, it's September the 3rd, and I'm here in DeKalb County, Tennessee. And if you're a local person here in DeKalb County, you know that our county commissioners have been discussing two things for some time now. They have been discussing the need for a school to be built, probably schools, plural, and then also a jail to be built, a county jail. The state has come in and said that it doesn't meet codes, and we even have prisoners that are in other counties, and we're having to pay for that because our building is not up to code today. This is not a new problem. This is something that our county has known about for some time, and they've worked on different plans. In fact, years ago, they expanded the jail, only to find out that recently they've come up with different standards. So even what we did, 10, 15 years ago, or however long that was, that's not even going to be acceptable in a facility today. So even the state or the U.S. penal system is changing the rules as they go along. And listen, that's a problem. A lot of oversight, and sometimes that's a problem. So as a county, we need to build a jail, but also we need to build a school, or plural, we need to build schools, perhaps. I was on a local community committee back when a former school superintendent was researching a school. I was pastoring in the county. This was probably over 15 years ago, and we were needing to build a new high school back then. And listen, this can has been kicked down the road even till today. At that time, 15 years ago, there was too much somewhat political infighting about it. There's always an issue with whose land are we going to buy. That gets political as well. And then also you have the whole situation to where the taxpayer really doesn't want to pay for a new school. No one wants their taxes to go up. No one wants a wheel tax and all these things. And listen, I'm someone that's had the opportunity to live in different counties, even different states. And guess what? My home county here, we want to have the things that everybody else has and things that we have to have in terms of infrastructure. But we just don't want to pay for it, or we don't want to have increased tax liability. And I get that. Nobody wants to pay more taxes. But in this time, what we find a questioning of leadership. And listen, I'm not saying we can't ask a question of leadership, but right now in our county, it's like no one thinks anybody else knows what they're doing. And so there's a lot of finger pointing and a lot of kicking the can down the road and wondering what we should do. Well, the county commissioners just recently voted that we would take this situation of getting some bonds in order to build a jail and also build a school, and that we would put it in a public referendum. So it will go on a ballot, an election ballot, and the public will vote on this. Now, I'm not so sure that's going to be the best thing. The public's probably going to vote it down. And then guess what? We're going to have to figure out how we're going to build a jail and how we're going to build a school when the public just voted no to increasing any kind of tax or any kind of ability to be able to do this. So I don't know where we're going to stand after that. We'll probably be back to square one, I'm sure, or in the minus category. But when you look at this, you find that we live in a free country, and I know we vote on things. We also elect these leaders to be in a position of leadership. And so we're hoping that they could lead us well and make good decisions. But in bringing it to a referendum means that the public's going to vote on this. And listen, it may come out fine, and I'm not saying here or there what we should do, but something has to be done on these two fronts. It has to be. There's no way we can kick this can down the road any further. And so, but when I look at this and I think about leadership and the responsibility of making decisions and calling shots and leading the people well, there's times where they need to do that. And sometimes if you ask the public, or if you ask, like if you're a business owner and you ask the consumer what they want, sometimes they're going to give you an answer that's just going to benefit them. It's not going to serve the whole. It's not going to serve everyone out there. And so, in fact, there's a quote there where Henry Ford, when he was creating the first automobile, when he was contemplating that, he said this. He said, if I'd asked the people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Instead, he gave them an automobile. He had to show them what they had been needing for some time, and then they walked into that and said, yeah, we really need an automobile. And so there's times in leadership you've got to show people really what they need. There's times you've got to like put it in front of them, give them some vision, help them see it. There's times that the public or a consumer, for instance, would actually want to just keep what they've been doing when maybe there is a new way and there's something that can be done that will bless them. Well, all this comes down to leadership. And this can has been kicked down the road a long time in DeKalb County, but it comes down to leadership or the lack of leadership, or in some cases, the failure to call a shot. The failure to call a shot. And then you've got people questioning who should call the shot, and they don't want anybody calling a shot. Listen, I've been a pastor for 25 years. I've been in different congregations over these years, and sometimes, I'll call a shot. I learned that back in the dealership days, back at Beeman Pontiac. Lee Beeman empowered us as leaders in our department to call shots that we needed to call. He could not come down and make every type of decision for us. We had to make decisions. And then, my boss that was immediately above me expected me to call shots and make decisions. And every now and then there might be someone that didn't like a decision that I made, but at the end of the day, they respected the situation that somebody's got to call a shot. Well, when we take a look at the Bible, we find a situation in Numbers chapter 12 where Moses had been leading for some time. He had been leading, and he had been fruitful. He had been following God. The people certainly had done their part in complaining. They've not always liked what Moses was doing or even how God was leading them, but the proof was in the pudding, and God was taking care of them. But Moses had been leading, and then in Numbers chapter 12, we have Miriam, Moses' sister, and we have Aaron, Moses' brother, begin to question and say to themselves, hey, listen, can't God tell us this vision? Is Moses the only one that God can talk to? And check this out. I'm going to read a few verses here. In Romans chapter 12, verse 1, it says, then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. Verse 2, so they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it, verse 2 says. Verse 3 says, now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. Verse 4, suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tabernacle of meeting. So the three came out. Then the Lord came down in the pillar of cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both went forward. Verse 6, the Lord said this, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly and not in dark sayings, and he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Verse 9, so the anger of the Lord was aroused against them, and he departed. Now, you heard that. Now, Miriam and Aaron are thinking, hey, we're just as good as Moses, and we can talk to God, and he can talk to us just like Moses. Here's the thing. What they didn't realize, it was God's prerogative and how he chose to speak to Moses, even if it was differently, even if it was in a way that Miriam and Aaron did not ever experience. That's, again, God's prerogative to do that. God chose Moses to be this type of leader. And Moses would share God's vision with the people, and then the leaders, the people then would go out and do the very things. And there was always some pushback. People were always thinking, well, why him? And there was a rejection of God's leadership, and also in God's leadership in choosing Moses. And then Moses' leadership, they were trying to reject it, and they were questioning his authority. And the people suffered every time that happened, every time. Now, I'm said all this not to say that you and I cannot have a question, but today it's cute and it's almost in fashion for us to completely question every leader all the time, to the point where we don't want anyone making decisions, or we want some big public vote about everything, anything and everything that goes on. And it's nearly impossible to do that. You have to trust leaders with the ability to call shots. Now, I get it. Somebody's going to say, well, now this tax situation affects all of us. I know it does. At the same time, I would say this, that there's a ton of choices and leadership decisions that are made by leaders that affect everybody. This one happens to have something to do with the pocketbook a little more maybe than some other decisions, and so we don't like that. And I get it. I understand that. So don't email me a wrong comment here. But when you look at this, what the Lord saw in Numbers 12, he saw this as somewhat high treason, that they're rejecting the leadership that God put in front of them, which was Moses. And if we read further, you find that Miriam becomes leprous. God allows her to have leprosy, like on the spot. And then when you take a look further, Moses pleads for her. He talks to God about it, and God and Moses have this dialogue. And God says to Moses, he says, hey, listen, he says, don't I have the right to do this, Moses? He says, if Miriam's father had just spit in her face, she would have to be separated from the people, because she would be unclean for so many days. So I have the right to do this. And so Miriam has leprosy, and then we find out later that God certainly, brought her health back and healed her of that. But what's interesting is that God was making a statement that he was using Moses to make these decisions. He was using Moses as a mouthpiece, and he expected the people to abide in that. Today, that flies all in the face of so many churches and so many organizations, that anyone would actually be in a place of leadership to where they can't ever be questioned. And now listen, I know when leaders do questionable things, we feel like we have to hold them account. I think that's fine, and that's understandable. But today, it's almost like we think no one should call a shot, or no one should make any decision, or that every decision should be somewhat by committee. Well, if you look at Numbers chapter 13, it's kind of interesting. So Numbers 12, we have this situation where Moses and Aaron they want other people to make decisions. Numbers 13, we find the Lord telling Moses, hey, send out spies into the promised land, the promised land they were walking into. He says, send out spies into that land and have them check it out. So it's almost as if you turn the page, in the very next chapter, the very next moment in history, after this incident with Miriam and Aaron and Moses, you find God saying, okay, you want it by committee? All right, send these spies into the land. Now listen, God had already promised them this land. God knew exactly what was going on in this land. And so they want other people to make decisions. So God tells Moses sends these spies into the land at the Lord's command. And some people could say, well, I think God was really wanting that to happen. I'll tell you what he was wanting. He was going to test God's people. He was also going to test God's people if they could remotely line up with his will. And here it is. If you read further, they didn't, they couldn't, they didn't want to. The spies come back. I won't tell you the whole story, but we know this, that these spies come back, and 10 out of the 12 spies give a bad report. Joshua and Caleb come back with a faith-filled report, but the people rejected the men of faith. So they reject Moses. They reject Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua come back saying, we can take the land. Yes, there's giants there. Yes, there's obstacles, but we can take this because God's with us. The other 10 spies gave a bad report, and the people listened to them. And next thing you know, they did not do God's will. They wander in the desert for 40 years. And that whole generation that wanted to make decisions on their own, that whole generation that did not want to listen to Moses, they die in the wilderness. And they wander for 40 years. And if you look at a map and they're wandering and they can't find their way back to the promised land, if you look at a map, they were no more than 10 days away from walking into the promised land at any given point. But God allowed them to walk in confusion because guess what? They wanted it. They absolutely wanted it. They didn't want Moses' leadership. They didn't want the leadership that God had set up. And God let them have what they think they wanted. Let me tell you, that is one of the most dangerous places you and I can ever be in, is when we don't want what God wants for us and we think that we know best, or we think that we could do it better, or we have a critique of how God's doing it, and then we want to do things our own way. If we're not careful, God just may let us do that, and that is one of the scariest positions you and I could ever be in. Well, I need to land the plane. It's a leadership podcast today, and that's fine because, listen, I've been a leader for ever since I was 18, and I've learned a lot of leadership principles over my lifetime. But this one right here, I've seen this come up, whether it was in the car business where every now and then somebody didn't want the leader to be making decisions. But listen, somebody's got to make a decision for the whole, and sometimes in your particular area of concern, you don't get it. You don't like the decision because maybe it affects you in some adverse way, but what if it helps the whole? And you just see it from your perspective. A leader's got to look at the whole. He or she have got to look at everything. And sometimes we're just sort of pigeonholed into looking at our situation from our own perspective. We're not thinking about everybody else. A leader's got to do that. He's got to do that. And every now and then, a leader can help this by sharing maybe with the group kind of the ins and outs of it. But a leader will not be able to stop every time they make a decision and explain everything that led up to that decision. They won't be able to do that to satisfy every person they want. They might can occasionally, but they won't on a regular basis be able to stop everybody and say, hey, this is exactly why we had to do what we did. They just can't do it all the time. But now, back to chapter 13, when we find these 10 spies come back with a bad report, this delegation and this leading by committee, if you will, aren't you glad that God did not send a committee down here to save us? He didn't send a committee. I tell you what, he sent a person. He sent the Lord Jesus Christ to come down here and die on the cross and rise from the dead. He didn't send a group to do that. He sent his only begotten Son. He didn't send maybe who the people thought he would send. And listen, the people thought that he should be sending some other type of Messiah, so they didn't believe Jesus was a Messiah. God sent who we needed, and that was Jesus Christ. Not a committee, but he sent Jesus Christ to come down here, the leader among all leaders. And let me tell you something. If you and I don't want to follow any earthly leadership, we better check and make sure that we're following the leadership of the Lord, because sometimes we don't even want his leadership. Listen, that's Proving God's Will. I've left you with a little bit of a cliffhanger. Tough word there today, but thanks for tuning in to Proving God's Will. Be sure and share this podcast or this YouTube channel with a friend. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you. Be sure and subscribe. Take care.